Okay guys, we are here shooting a time lapse today. I've been getting a lot of questions from you guys wanting to know my time lapse workflow from beginning to end. So we are here first on set. This is actually where I took my profile picture, if you guys have seen that. And I'm just gonna show you the basics, and then I'm gonna take you into the workflow in post so you can see step by step how I put it all together. So first things first, if you have a Canon camera, they don't have an internal intervalometer, which means you have to buy one of these stupid dongle thingies. These are like $10, maybe $20 off of Amazon, depending on the brand you get. So buy one of these if you want to shoot time lapses with a Canon camera. I know that Nikon and other cameras have them built in, but since I'm a Canon user, we're going to be using one of these today. So first things first, we're going to plug in our intervalometer here. On this camera, it's on my right side, but usually it's on the left side. So plug that in, make sure it's on nice and tight. Now we're going to get our camera settings set up. Now, depending on the type of time lapse you're shooting will depend on the settings you use. As a general rule of thumb, you want to have some kind of motion when you're shooting a time lapse. If you're just shooting a landscape or something and nothing's moving, then it's pointless to shoot a time lapse. Right now I have a little bit of clouds in the sky, and that's about all the movement I'm going to have because I'm out here in nature and nothing else is going to be moving. If there were no clouds, this would be a pretty pointless time lapse. You'd see the sun going down, but that's about it. So look for as many elements as you can to be moving when you're shooting a time lapse. As far as settings go, if you are wanting to have some motion blur to people or traffic or water moving in a shot, then you have to bump the shutter speed down. And if you're shooting in the middle of the day, that means you need to have an ND filter. What an ND filter does is it blocks a bunch of light from reaching your camera, which allows you to bump down your shutter speed to get more motion blur. In this case, since there isn't a lot moving, I'm not gonna worry about putting on an ND filter, and so I'm okay with my shutter speed being higher. And with the aperture, I usually want it to be somewhere between 8 and 16, so it's a little bit higher so I can get more in focus in my image. For time lapses like this, you're usually gonna have your shutter speed a little bit lower and the aperture higher so you can get a lot more in focus. So for this specific time lapse, I'm shooting into the sun. My settings are gonna be at ISO 400, which is my native ISO. I'm gonna put my aperture all the way up to 16, and my shutter speed I'm gonna set to 250. Now with those settings as they are right now, my darks are kind of crushed, but I'm doing that so that I can see all the sky, so the sky isn't blown out, so I can see the movement of the clouds in my image. And I'll just bring up the shadows in post because I'm shooting all this in RAW, so I'm gonna have a lot of latitude to push and pull my highlights and shadows. And that's one rule you're gonna wanna keep in mind. Always shoot in RAW when you're shooting time lapses. You're gonna have a lot more editing creativity in post. Now, a couple things that are important. You wanna set your white balance to manual. I'm gonna set mine to 5600 Kelvin, and you wanna make sure your autofocus is turned off, or else the focus is gonna be changing every time, especially if it's pointing at the sun. So set it to infinity focus, or wherever you want your image to be in focus at, and then make sure to switch your lens to manual. And then obviously, as a rule of thumb, you want the camera to be stationary. So we got it set up on a tripod. Everything should be set, ready to go. Now let's move on to the settings within the intervalometer. So I'm gonna go ahead and flip that on. So the only numbers we're really worrying about here are we wanna make sure our intervalometer, INT, is set to whatever amount of seconds we want in between every photo it's taking. Now for me, I want quite a few photos in a short amount of time, so I'm gonna put it at about 2 seconds. I'll typically go about 2 to 5 seconds if I'm doing a time lapse that's maybe 20 to 30 minutes. And then obviously, depending on certain scenarios, I'm gonna have that higher or lower. But for now, we're just gonna go ahead and put that at 2 seconds. And then our other number we wanna worry about is N, which is total number of images it's gonna take. You can set a certain amount you wanna take. For me, I like to set it to infinity, which means it's just gonna continue taking them until I turn the camera off. So we're set to infinity photos, 2 seconds in between each photo, and these other two you don't have to worry about. So we should be all set to go. So I'm gonna go ahead and just start my intervalometer, and there we go. So every 2 seconds, it's taking a photo, and it's gonna keep taking them until I stop this. So we have some sad news. Right as I started my time lapse, it looks like we're about to lose our sun, which is a very sad thing because I love the sun. The tough part is going to be, since I started it while the sun was out, and then midway through, it's going to go to completely overcast because of the cloud. It's going to change my exposure completely of my time lapse. So what I usually do in these kinds of scenarios is, since I'm not too far into the time lapse, I'm only about 2 or 3 minutes into it, I'll actually restart it, reset my exposure, and go again. All right, so we stopped our time lapse. It is now completely overcast. So I'm going to show you what that looks like right now. You can see some awesome cloud movement, and that time lapse actually works. That went for about 10 minutes before the sun was completely gone. You'll see the clouds moving nicely. That movement makes our time lapse worth doing. However, because we are completely overcast now, I'm going to bump up my exposure a bit. We're going to start a new one that's exposed better for the overcast. So I still want to make sure my sky isn't blown out, but instead of about a 300 shutter speed, we're now looking at about a 60th of a shutter speed. So that way we can still pull up the shadows, but we're not losing too many of the highlights in the sky still. So everything's the same. We've just lowered the shutter speed a little bit to better expose for the overcast, and now we're going to go ahead and start again. So this time I'm going to set the intervalometer to every 4 seconds it's going to take a photo, and what you're going to see is basically now your time lapse is going to be twice as fast. So the clouds are going to move twice as fast because we're going through time quicker. So the math on that would be every 4 seconds you're getting about 15 photos per minute, which means I'm getting about 150 photos every 10 minutes. And generally I like to shoot at least 300 photos per time lapse, which means this has to go for a total of 20 minutes in order for me to get 300 photos. And I want to have at least a 10 to 15 second time lapse to work with. All right, so here's what we're gonna do. My time lapse has been rolling for about 4 minutes, and then at this point I'm gonna walk into the frame and I'm gonna do my pose, but I'm gonna do it in a way where I only move every 8 seconds. So I'm gonna move super slow, and over a span of about 6 or 7 minutes, I'm gonna be doing my pose. I'm gonna hold it for a minute or two, as long as I can, and then I'm going to get out. So that's going to take me about 8 minutes of total time, and in time-lapse time it's about 5 seconds. So in the time-lapse it'll be me walking up and then I'll walk off. But all around me, hopefully you'll be seeing the clouds moving over that time. Okay, so that was a lot harder than I thought. That's a freaking heavy camera. So we'll cut to that right now so you can see how it looked. I'm not sure how it's gonna look, if it's gonna look natural with me doing that nice and slow. It might look kind of weird, but I did the best I could. Okay, so that last one was really hard for me to walk in and walk out over a long period of time holding a heavy camera. So instead of doing a 4 second interval, we're gonna do a 1 second interval so that I don't have to be out there so long. All right, it is 8:25, so we've been rolling this time lapse for about 14 minutes. So we'll now show you what that one looks like all put together. That was at 1 second intervals, me going in for about 5 minutes, which should equate to about 5 or 6 seconds of time lapse footage. All right, so we are now shooting our night time lapse, and the direction we were shooting with our Lion King rock wasn't looking very good because it was just a bunch of clouds and we couldn't see any stars. So I whipped the camera over this way to a different side of the mountain where I could see the moon and some stars. And so now we're gonna take a time lapse here at night. I just wanted to give you guys an idea of what it's like to both shoot a day time lapse and a night time lapse. Now the main difference with a night time lapse is you're just gonna have a lot higher shutter speed and a lower aperture. So to give you an idea of the settings I'm using right now, I'm shooting at a 30 shutter speed, my aperture is at 4, and my ISO is at 400. So that's going to give me an evenly exposed image, but that means it's gonna take 30 full seconds to shoot one image, which means it's gonna take 12 minutes of me sitting here doing a time lapse in order to get 1 second of time lapse video, which means I'm gonna be here for several hours just to get a 10 to 15 second time lapse. So to save time, and if you are low on time and don't have a few hours to sit around doing a night time lapse, what you can do is take your aperture down. I'm gonna go down to 2.8, boost my ISO up to 1600, and that will allow me to take my shutter speed down to about 2 or 3 seconds. Now the trade-off is my image is going to be a little bit grainier, not quite as sharp, but this way I can shoot a time lapse in about 20 minutes and still get a cool night time lapse. So in this case, that's what I'm going to do, and we're going to go ahead and start it right now, and then I'm going to show you in post how I put that together. Okay, so we are now in the post-production process of putting together those time lapses I just shot. I've already dumped all the footage and I've organized all those time lapses into 5 different folders. That's the first step, is you want to go through all those photos you shot and make sure to make individual folders for every one of those time lapses. Step 2 is open to preference. I like to use a combination of Adobe Bridge, After Effects, and Premiere Pro, so I'm going to show you my process right now. So let's go ahead and open up Adobe Bridge. Go ahead and locate your folders of time lapses. And we'll go ahead and start with our first time lapse. So I'll open that up, and then it will pull up previews of all the photos you shot within that time lapse. So now we're going to begin the editing process, which means we want to select one file that will represent our time lapse as a whole. So select a file that has the right exposure that you want to be editing the whole time lapse for, and then right click, open in Camera Raw, and that's going to open up your Camera Raw editor, which you can then start to color correct your file. And now I'm going to take you through my full color correction process on a raw photo. This is open to creative preference, guys, but I'm going to show you the way I like to do it. First off, you're going to see my color balance is off. My tint was super low, so we're going to bring that up to 0. I like to have a little bit warmer image, so we're going to bring that up to about 60. We'll go 6300. Exposure is looking pretty good. You'll notice my highlights are clipping up here. When it shows white, that means it's clipping. So I'm actually going to bring my highlights down so we're in the black. And what that does also is it gives us more detail up on the sky. So I'm going to bring back a little bit of that detail and get rid of that clipping. Because this is a raw photo, it means it's usually pretty flat, so I'm going to put a little bit of contrast in there. You'll notice my shadows are also clipping a little bit. I'm going to bring those up just a tad to kind of help bring up those shadows a little bit and even out the exposure on my image. And I also like to put a little bit of clarity in there, just a little punch for some detail. And then of course I like to have a nice vibrant saturated image. So that's my basic color correction right there. You can toggle this guy down here in the bottom to show the before and after. Now let's move along the line to our sharpening and noise reducing. I think it's already plenty sharp, so I'm not going to touch that. However, I always put a little bit of noise reduction on my time lapses, and the reason for that is when you're working with these still images all put together, you're going to get a little bit of noise in the image because of the super high detail. So to kind of soften that out, I bring up my noise reduction to about 20 or 30, somewhere between there. So that's a big step. Make sure to put a little bit of noise reduction in there. And then working with individual colors, sometimes I'll come in here and say let's boost up our blues in the sky a little bit, bring down our luminance just a tad, maybe boost the yellows a little bit and our luminance there, and a little more saturated. So here's the before and after, making our colors pop. Then we're going to come over to lens corrections. I like to enable profile corrections, not always, but a lot of times it looks better in my opinion. What this does is it gets rid of the distortion that my lens creates and kind of straightens out some of my lines, and it also gets rid of the vignette around the image. And then that's pretty much it. So there's my before and after. Now that I have it the way I like, I want to make sure to make a preset of this edit I've just done. And we're going to call this. So there you have it. Go ahead and push done, and you'll see here it's made that edit to that photo, but I want it to now make it to all the photos. So push Command A, which will select all 353 photos, and then right click, come down to Develop Settings, find your preset, Lion King Rock 1, click on that, and it will now start editing all of those photos according to the edit you just did for that one. So you can see it there, editing each photo individually. You don't have to wait for those previews to render out. You can go ahead and jump into step number 3, which is open up Adobe After Effects, and we're now going to put all those photos together into one sequence. So let's go ahead and import our time lapse now. We're going to say import, make sure to select multiple files. Again, locate your time lapses. And now you're going to see a bunch of XMP files in here. Those are the edits you did. Ignore those and scroll down to your CR2s, your actual photos. Select any of them, push open. It's going to show you your preview of the edit you did. It's going to say, is this the edit you like? Yes, click OK. And it now imported those 353 files as a sequence. So go ahead and exit out of this now, push cancel. Take your new sequence it just created, drag it down to new sequence, this little square right here. And now you have your time lapse all put together over this timeline. Now if you try and play this back, because these files are so humongous, it's not going to play back very well, so I don't even worry about trying to play back the time lapse right here. I just click through and make sure the whole time lapse is there. I'll just pick random spots in here, and it looks like the whole time lapse is there. So it looks good on here. It is, however, set to 30 frames per second. So I'm going to right click up here, interpret footage, main, and we're going to go to 23.976 frames per second. And now you're ready to export this as a video file. So go up here to File, Export, Add to Render Queue. It will now pull up your render queue. And this is important, you want to make sure these settings are correct. You're going to come down here and click on Lossless, which will pull up your output module settings. I like to export mine out as a QuickTime, and then I come in here to Format Options, and instead of an animation, I'm going to click Apple ProRes 422. And then we're good to go. And then come over here to Output 2, and we're going to rename this. I'm going to say Mountain Timelapse 1, and I like to come into here and create a new folder called Finished Timelapses. You can organize this any way you want, but that way I know where the final video outputs are at. And I'm going to save this first time lapse into Finished Timelapses, and then go ahead and start rendering. Now depending on how many photos you took will depend on how long this is going to take. Also depending on the speed of your computer. It looks like this is going to take about a half hour to render out that one time lapse. So while that's rendering, I usually like to go back and start editing my next time lapse, and by the time I finish editing my second time lapse, hopefully this one is close to being finished. So let's go ahead and jump back over to Adobe Bridge, and let's pull up our second time lapse. So again, you want to find the photo that is the most prominent in your time lapse and make sure to edit that one first so that the rest of your time lapse conforms to that edit. So right click, open in Camera Raw. And as you can see, this image is very dark. I did this on purpose, guys, so I could maintain the detail in the sky. We're still clipping a little bit in the highlights and then clipping a lot in the shadows. And so I wanted to maintain all that detail in my highlights. That's why I undershot and exposed for the highlights and not the shadows. Because watch this, we can bring our highlights down to make sure we maintain all of that detail, bring our shadows up, bring our exposure up, bring our contrast up, a little bit more on the exposure, maybe a little less in the shadows. But you see here now, we're not clipping in the shadows or the highlights, both are in the black, and the before and after shows that we were able to pull all the detail out of those shadows and still maintain everything in the highlights. Now my color balance is a bit off. We're going to bring this back up to 0. And you'll see my white balance is too cool because it was set for the sunlight. The sun is gone, it's now shade, which means we want to bring this up more around 7 or 8,000. I'm going to go all the way up to 8,000. Let's also put a little bit of clarity on there. Give me some vibrance and saturation. Put on our noise reduction. I'm going to put a little bit more on this one. We're going to have a little bit of noise in our image down in our shadows because I underexposed this image a little bit. So we're going to bring that noise reduction up. I'm going to play around with these individual colors for a second. I want to kind of bring out the sunset on this one. So I'm going to bring out my oranges. I want the red on my shirt to show up a little bit better. Maybe a little bit of yellow. I actually don't like the aqua color in here. So I'm going to bring that down a little bit. Come over to luminance. Gonna bring out my shirt a little bit more, and that should be good. Just a little bit of color adding in there. Now let's go ahead and enable the profile correction now. Straighten this image out a little bit. Very nice. So let's look at our before and after now, and that's pretty drastic. I mean, you can barely see anything, and now the image looks bright as day. So that right there, folks, is the power of RAW. I'm gonna go ahead and call that good. Make sure to make a preset. I'm going to call this Lion King Rock 2. Done. Now we're going to select all, Command A, right click, develop settings, Lion King Rock 2, and now it will set that color correction to my entire image here. So that's my basic process, guys, of compiling the time lapses. Let's go back to After Effects, and it looks like we're only about a third of the way done putting together my first time lapse. So we're going to go ahead and cut to me now having finished all 6 of those time lapses, and then I'm going to show you what I do with them once they've been exported out of After Effects. Alright, so I just finished exporting out the 5 time lapses that I took up there on the mountain. Now it's time for our final step where I bring it into Premiere Pro. So let's go ahead and open up Premiere Pro. I'm just going to start a new project. Okay, so let's go ahead and import our time lapses. Here are our finished time lapses. Import those. And I forgot the last step, interpreting footage on the rest of these. So we're going to do that now, 23.976. So you can interpret the footage in After Effects, or you can do it once you pull it into here. By default, After Effects goes to 30 frames. Just make sure you go down to 24 frames. So now if I were to bring these in and make their own new sequence, the problem is we're going to have an aspect ratio of 3:2, and we don't want a video aspect ratio of 3:2, nor do we want a project that's in 5.5K, which is what these photos are shot in. So what I like to do is bring in an existing video that I've already exported out in the settings I like. This one is in 1080p because I'm going to be exporting this video in 1080p, and then I just go ahead and bring in my time lapses into this new timeline. Now the first thing you're going to notice is it's cropped in, and so we're going to take one of these clips and zoom it back out until we reach the edge here. You'll notice that I have room on top and bottom here to crop exactly where I want to. And then we'll go ahead and Command C and then Option V, paste the attributes of that first clip so they all fit in the frame like so. And then obviously I will adjust these as needed. So there you have my time lapses. Here's the first one shot in the sunlight. Obviously be aware, I wasn't very careful on these because I was shooting behind the scenes, but be aware that if you step anywhere near your frame, you might accidentally go inside it and ruin your time lapse, so make sure you stay clear of your frame. And so you can see there, I exposed for the sun went away, and look how dark it is now. Now there's a workaround to this. As it begins to shift lights, you can cut that in half, change the exposure on this second half. I'm just going to throw in a curve here, an RGB curve, something like that. And then I'm going to warm it up a little bit more and a little more saturation. So before and after, I've just warmed it up, and then I can apply default transition, and that can help you transition between a sunny and an overcast clip like that. You blend the two together and it's pretty seamless. So just a little trick there to compensate for 2 different exposures. Moving on to the next one here. Looks like my walking is a little bit unnatural, but that's kind of a cool look where I'm walking into frame with all the clouds moving. So again, I was walking over a time of about 10 minutes, and it translates into about 6 seconds. Here's another one. This one is a lot longer. I took a lot more still frames. So I believe the interval between every photo on this one was about 4 seconds. So you can see how fast the clouds are moving when you do an interval of 4 seconds. And here's how fast the clouds are moving with an interval of 1 second. So obviously a lot less movement, but I can also come here to speed duration, and I can quadruple that to be the same amount of cloud movement as the one before that. So you have some latitude there if you do shorter intervals and take more photos. So again, this one's longer. I have more footage to work with because I did shorter intervals. And then here's our last one. I believe this interval was 1 second as well. Now on this one, I actually put a light on me because it started getting too dark to see the foreground. So I'm actually being backlit over here by one of my LED lights. And then our last one was a night shot at about 3.2 second exposure with 1 second in between. And this was the final result. You see the planes going back and forth over here, the cloud movement. And if we were to do that one long enough, we'd even see the stars moving as well. Now I'm going to take one of these time lapses and just show you something that can be done here. So let's take this one. It's probably my favorite. And I'm going to show you some tricks that you can do to make it seem like the time lapse is moving. And I did this in my time lapse video I did for Devon Supertramp when we went to Rome. I'd zoom in and out the time lapses to make it look like I was using a rig, when really I was just using a tripod. So I'm going to come to the beginning of my clip here. I'm going to come up to motion. We're going to toggle on the animation for position and scale. I'm going to start this out all the way zoomed out, and we're going to bring it down a little bit. So all the way down to the bottom of the image is our starting point. I'm going to slide these over to the very end. I'm going to find my end point to be right here, and I'm going to scale this to zoom in. And remember, I shot this in 5K, so I have some latitude to work with. And then position this down so that I'm filling the frame nicely. And then we're going to zoom back out to finish the time lapse. And we're going to drift up this time. So if I were to speed that up, let's times it by 3 so you can see that in fast motion. Slightly zooming in, and then back out, and it continues going up. So you can give your time lapses a little bit of motion. That's called a digital zoom when I'm zooming in and out, and that's how you achieve that. That's pretty much it, guys, for creating a time lapse. That's my post-production workflow. First is to make sure every time lapse is in its own individual folder, then bring it into Adobe Bridge to edit an individual photo, apply that edit to all of them, and then bring it into After Effects to compile it into one video file, and then bring that video file into Premiere Pro, where you can then do digital zooms and any other effects that you want to add on top of that within your editing program. So that's it, guys, for my time-lapse workflow. If you guys have any further questions, please let me know.